The arrow was already nocked when Calvin Doyle stepped between it and the orc woman kneeling over the stag. "Hold," he said, and his voice cracked on the word, because 3 of Lord Bramwell's men-at-arms had their bows drawn and their knuckles white, and he was standing in the exact spot where their arrows wanted to go. "Doyle, get out of the way," snapped Corliss, the eldest of the keepers, a man with a scar through one eyebrow and no patience left after 2 winters of poaching along the border. "That's an orc raider with her hands in the Lord's deer. The law says—" "I know what the law says." Calvin did not move. Behind him he could hear the woman breathing hard, could smell the copper tang of the stag's blood soaking into the snow, could hear the small, dangerous sound of a blade being palmed even as she knelt there, unwilling to simply die on her knees. "The law says poachers hang. It doesn't say we put 3 arrows in a woman's back while she's field dressing a starving clan's only meal in a month. She's an orc. She's a person with an empty larder same as half of Ashford Hollow this winter." Calvin's hands were empty and spread, showing no weapon, though his hunting knife sat heavy at his belt, and his heart was slamming against his ribs hard enough to hurt. "Lower the bows." For one endless breath nobody moved. The forest around them was the color of iron, the pines bowed under old snow, and the light coming through the canopy was thin and gray, the kind of light that made every choice feel final. Then behind him the orc woman rose. She rose slowly, deliberately, and even half frozen and caught red-handed. She did not cower. She was tall, taller than any of the men-at-arms, built with the dense, coiled strength of a warrior rather than the softness of a farmwife. Her skin, a deep mossy green, touched gold where the weak sun found her jaw. Her hair was black, braided close against her skull, and threaded through with small iron rings that clicked faintly when she moved. She wore fitted leathers the color of old rust, laced tight along her ribs and hips, a warrior's cut built for movement rather than modesty, and over one shoulder a fur mantle spotted with the fresh blood of the stag. Twin tusks, small and pale, showed at the corners of her mouth when she spoke, and her eyes, amber and furious, fixed on Calvin like he was the strangest thing she had seen all winter. "You would die for a stranger's meat, human," she said. Her voice was low, roughened, and there was no fear in it at all, only a kind of astonished contempt that had nowhere yet to land. "I'd rather not die at all," Calvin said, "but I'm not going to stand here and watch 3 men murder a woman for being hungry. Not on my watch, not in my wood." "Your wood," she repeated as if tasting the strangeness of it. "I'm the gamekeeper, Calvin Doyle." He said his own name like an apology because it felt small next to the moment. "This is Lord Bramwell's forest, and I'm the one who's meant to keep it, so I suppose that makes it my business who dies in it." Corliss spat into the snow. "Doyle, if she runs, we lose the treaty parley." Boyd's men have been itching for an excuse to burn the border camps for a year. "She's not running." Calvin didn't take his eyes off her, though every animal instinct in him screamed too. "Are you?" The orc woman's jaw tightened. Behind her, deeper in the trees, Calvin caught the faint shift of shadow that told him she had not come alone. There would be others, watching, waiting for a signal. And if this went wrong, there would be more blood in this clearing than one stag's. But she did not call to them. She simply looked at him, the strange, stubborn, unarmed human standing between her and 3 drawn bows, and something in her expression shifted from contempt into something far more careful. "I will not run," she said. "I do not run from anything." "Then nobody needs to shoot anybody." Calvin turned, slow, showing his back to her, a foolish, reckless thing, and he knew it even as he did it, and faced the keepers instead. "Lower your bows. I'll answer for this to Lord Bramwell myself." One stag, taken by a starving raiding party in a hard winter, is not worth a war nobody in this wood wants. It was Corliss who broke first, lowering his bow with a disgusted curse, and the other 2 followed, because they had followed Corliss for years and trusted him more than they trusted the strange, soft-hearted gamekeeper who had a habit of looking the other way when snares turned up in the wood set by village children too hungry to wait for the Lord's mercy. When Calvin turned back, the orc woman had not fled. She stood over the stag, one hand resting on its ribs, watching him with an expression he could not read. "You are either the bravest man I have met," she said, "or the greatest fool." "Probably both," Calvin admitted. "Go on, take the meat. Go quickly before they change their minds." She studied him a moment longer, amber eyes narrow, and then she crouched, hauled the stag onto her shoulders with a strength that made the keepers behind him mutter, and began to walk backward into the trees, never once turning her back on him fully, the way a wolf does not turn its back on a thing it has not decided whether to trust. "What is your name again?" she asked from the tree line. "Calvin Doyle. I am Vola Doomhammer." She said it the way a queen says her own name to a subject, not out of vanity, but because it was simply true. "I will remember it, Calvin Doyle." And then she was gone into the gray trees, and the forest closed up behind her like water over a stone, and Calvin stood there with his heart hammering and the cold air burning his lungs, wondering why the woman's voice saying his name had done something to his chest that 3 drawn arrows had not. Lord Bramwell was not pleased to learn that a stag had gone missing from his private wood, nor pleased to learn that his gamekeeper had let an armed orc walk free with it slung over her shoulder. Calvin stood in the manor hall 2 days later, hat in his hands, and took the dressing down without flinching, because there was nothing to say in his own defense except the truth, and the truth would have gotten Vola Doomhammer hunted. "You had bows on her," Lord Bramwell said, pacing before the hearth, his velvet coat too fine for a man who had never once walked his own borders in winter. "You had 3 men and clean shots, and you let her walk." "I did, my lord." "Why?" Calvin thought of amber eyes, of a voice that said her own name like a fact of the world, and said none of that. "Because killing her would have started a war we can't afford, my lord, and because the law that says poachers hang was written for men who steal for greed, not for people whose children are eating bark. If we want peace with the clans above the fjord, we might start by not slaughtering their scouts over one deer." It was not the answer Lord Bramwell wanted, but it happened to be true, and true things had a way of outliving a lord's temper. Bramwell grumbled, fined Calvin a month's wage, and put the matter aside, until, 3 weeks later, a rider came down from the high passes with the Doomhammer clan's black andiron banner tied to his spear, requesting a parley, and Calvin Doyle's name was on the list of men summoned to attend it, because the Orc Chieftess herself had asked for him by name. The road up to Scarnholt, the Doomhammer clan hold, climbed through 3 days of switchbacks cut into granite, past waterfalls frozen mid-fall into blue-white curtains, until the trees thinned and the world opened onto the great fjord below, a black mirror of water hemmed in by cliffs so tall they swallowed the afternoon sun by midday. The hold itself sprawled along a shelf of rock above the water, a cluster of long, low longhouses roofed in turf and hide, smoke rising from a dozen hearths, banners of black iron rings snapping in the wind, and beyond it all, watchtowers of unmortared stone that had stood, by the look of them, since before Calvin's grandfather's grandfather had been born. He rode with Lord Bramwell's delegation, a dozen guards, a scribe, and Lord Bramwell's nephew and heir, Edmund, a young man with a fine jaw and finer opinions of himself, who complained the whole ride up about the cold, the smell of the tanning pits they passed, and the indignity of treating with beasts as though they were men. Calvin said little. He had not told anyone, not even himself in so many words, why his stomach had not settled since the rider's summons had come. They were received in the great hall of Scarnholt, a long timber building smoky with hearth fire and hung with old shields and antlers and the great curved horns of some beast Calvin did not recognize. At the far end, on a low dais of black stone, sat Vola Doomhammer, and seeing her again, seated in her own hall with the fire-like gold on her skin, Calvin understood for the first time that the woman in the winter wood had been dressed for hunting, not for rule. Now she wore fitted leathers dyed a deep forest green, laced up the front of a high collar and cinched tight at the waist with a wide belt of hammered iron plates, the whole of it cut close to a figure built of lean, coiled muscle, feminine and formidable at once. Her black hair was rebraided, more rings threaded through it now, a mark, he would later learn, of status rather than vanity. A single iron torque sat at her throat. She looked, sitting there with one leg crossed over the other, and her chin lifted, like a woman who had never once in her life doubted her right to the seat beneath her. Her amber eyes found Calvin the moment he entered, and something in her stern expression eased just slightly, just for him. "Gamekeeper," she said before Lord Bramwell had even finished his bow. "You came." "I was summoned, Chieftess," Calvin said, because it seemed the safer answer, though it was not the true one. The true one was that he had not stopped thinking of her. "You were summoned because I asked for you." Vola rose from the dais, and several of the elders flanking her, grim, gray-tusked warriors with scars mapping their arms, exchanged glances that Calvin did not yet know how to read. "This is the man who stood unarmed between his own lord's arrows and my back. I do not forget such debts." Lord Bramwell, caught wrong-footed, recovered quickly, because he had not climbed 3 days of mountain road to be upstaged by his own gamekeeper. "Chieftess Doomhammer, we come in good faith, to discuss an end to the raids along the border and a lasting peace between your clan and the Crown's lands." "Peace," said one of the elders, an old warrior with a jaw like broken stone, his voice thick with scorn. "Peace, from the men who burned Halgrimsteding 3 winters past." "And peace," Vola said sharply, cutting off whatever her elder meant to say next, "from a chieftess whose people have eaten bark and boiled hide through 2 hard winters because we keep bleeding warriors on your border fences instead of hunting our own game. I did not summon you to relive old grievances, Croth. I summoned them to end this." The old warrior, Croth, Calvin filed the name away, subsided, though his glare did not soften. It was clear, even to a gamekeeper who had never sat at a Lord's Council table, that Vola's authority in this hall was not gently held. She gripped it, and men like Croth resented the grip. The negotiations that followed took the better part of that first day and stretched into 3 more. Boundary lines were drawn along the river instead of the disputed ridge, hunting rights shared in the border wood during the hard months, an exchange of grain for furs come autumn. Calvin, as the man who knew the wood better than anyone in Bramwell's retinue, found himself called on again and again to settle disputes about deer trails and boundary stones, and each time Vola's eyes found his across the long hall, there was something in them that made him forget, briefly, the cold and the smoke and the old warrior Croth's continued glowering. It was on the 4th day that Lord Bramwell, sensing the treaty nearly won, played the card he had clearly been saving. "To bind this peace beyond mere paper," he said, standing with the self-satisfaction of a man about to be very clever, "I propose a marriage. My nephew Edmund, heir to my lands, to you, Chieftess, a joining of our 2 houses. What treaty could hold firmer than blood?" The hall went very still. Edmund, to his credit, at least had the decency to look faintly nauseated at being offered like a prize hog, though Calvin suspected it was less the thought of marrying an orc that troubled him, and more the thought of marrying anyone at all who might expect him to behave. Vola's face did not move for a long moment. Then she looked, not at Edmund, but for one bare second, so quick Calvin almost missed it, at Calvin himself, before turning back to Lord Bramwell with the flat, controlled expression of a woman doing arithmetic she did not like. "There is a law in my clan," she said slowly, "older than either of our houses. No Doomhammer chieftain may wed human blood. It has stood since the Ashen Vow was broken 200 years past, when a chieftess's human husband opened these very gates to his own kin in the night, and my ancestors bled out on this floor for trusting him." Her hand rested briefly on the black stone of the dais beneath her, as though she could still feel the old stain in it. "The ban of ashen vows. It is not mine to break for the sake of a treaty." Croth, behind her, made a low sound of satisfaction, as though the matter were settled, and rightly so. Lord Bramwell, undeterred, pressed. "Then perhaps a lesser arrangement, a betrothal in name only, to satisfy the treaty's terms without the full weight of your law. I did not say I refuse peace, Vola said, cutting him off again, and there was something tired beneath the iron in her voice now. I said the law forbids the marriage you ask. I will consider what may satisfy both. But it will take more thought than an old man's eagerness to marry off a nephew he plainly does not want. Edmund flushed. Lord Bramwell, wisely, did not push further that night. Calvin was given a small chamber off the great hall to sleep in, more storeroom than guest quarters, but warm enough, and he lay awake a long while listening to the wind come down off the fjord cliffs and thinking about the strange ache in his chest every time Vola Doomhammer looked at him like she was trying to solve something. He did not have to wait long to find out. The following days settled into an uneasy rhythm. The treaty terms were drafted and redrafted. Lord Bramwell's scribe filled page after page with clauses about grain and grazing and border patrols, while the matter of the marriage clause sat unresolved, a stone in the river that the whole current had to bend around. Calvin, with no formal role in the drafting, found himself given small tasks instead, walking the boundary lines with Vola's own scouts to mark them honestly, settling a dispute over a poached elk that nearly mirrored his first meeting with her, mediating between Bramwell's guards and the clan's younger warriors when tempers over old grievances threatened to boil. It was on one such walk, along the ridge above the fjord where the wind cut sharp enough to sting, that Vola herself joined him, unannounced, falling into step beside him with the easy, prowling grace of a woman who had walked these cliffs since she could walk at all. You did not have to volunteer for the boundary walk, she said. Croth would have sent his own men. I wanted the air, Calvin said, which was half true. The other half he was not yet brave enough to say aloud. You wanted to avoid my hall, where Edmund complains of the smell and Croth glares holes into your back. Calvin laughed, surprised into it. Maybe a little of that, too. He studied him sideways, the wind pulling a loose strand of black hair across her cheek. You are not what I expected from a human gamekeeper. What did you expect? A coward with a bow like most of them, or a cruel man enjoying small power over a wood, not a man who stands unarmed between arrows and a stranger's back because he thought it right. She said it plainly, without flattery, the way she seemed to say everything, as a simple fact laid on the table between them. It has stayed with me. I do not forget kindness any more than I forget cruelty. I didn't do it to be remembered, Calvin said. I did it because I couldn't stand there and watch. That, Vola said, is exactly why it stayed with me. They walked in silence a while after that. The fjord spread silver-black below them, gulls wheeling over the water, and Calvin was intensely, uncomfortably aware of how close her shoulder was to his, how the wind carried the smell of leather and wood smoke from her, how his heart had not slowed since she'd fallen into step beside him. You're Lord Bramwell's nephew, Vola said eventually, looks at my clan like we are cattle to be counted. He has never once looked me in the eye when he speaks. He's a fool, Calvin said, before he could think better of it. You deserve better than a man who can't look at you. Something shifted in her expression, surprise, and beneath it, a warmth she seemed almost annoyed to feel. Careful, gamekeeper. That sounded almost like jealousy. Maybe it was, Calvin admitted, because lying to her felt like it would cost more than the truth would. I don't have any right to it. You're a chieftess and I'm a man who keeps another man's deer. But I've thought about you since that morning in the snow more than I've thought about anything else, and I'm too tired of pretending otherwise to start now. Vola stopped walking. He stopped too, turning to face her, the wind whipping between them, and for a long moment she only looked at him with those amber eyes gone very still, searching his face as though she expected to find the lie in it and could not. No one has spoken to me so plainly in a very long time, she said finally, quietly. My own people speak to me as their chieftess. Bramwell's men speak to me as a problem to be solved. You speak to me as though I am simply a woman standing on a cliff. You are a woman standing on a cliff, Calvin said. You're also a chieftess who could have my head for saying any of this. I know that. I know it too. A small, unwilling smile touched the corner of her mouth, catching on one pale tusk. and yet I find I do not want you to stop." She reached out then and touched his jaw with 2 fingers, calloused and warm despite the cold wind, tilting his face slightly as though studying him in new light, and Calvin's breath caught entirely. "Vola, I have not decided anything," she said, low, though her thumb had drifted to trace the line of his cheekbone, betraying a decision already half made. "I am chieftess of a clan bound by an old law and older grief. I cannot simply—" "I know," Calvin said again, softer this time. "But I wanted, at least once, to touch your face and know it was real," she admitted. And there was something raw in the confession that told him this was not a woman given easily to admitting want. He did not close the distance between them. He let her, because it felt like the right thing to let her choose. And she did choose, closing the gap and kissing him there on the wind-scoured ridge above the fjord with a hunger that startled them both, one hand fisting in the front of his coat, as though she meant to make sure he did not somehow slip away into the gray afternoon. He kissed her back with all the careful, disbelieving wonder of a man who had spent years overlooked and unclaimed, suddenly and thoroughly chosen, and when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vola pressed her forehead briefly to his, tusks careful not to catch, and let out a short, unsteady laugh. "This is a very poor idea," she said. "Probably," Calvin agreed. "I intend to have it again regardless." He grinned, dizzy with it. "I'm not going to argue with a chieftess." They did not speak of it in the hall, not with Croth's suspicious eyes tracking every movement and Edmund's sour commentary filling every meal. But the ridge became, in the days that followed, a place they returned to whenever the negotiations allowed, stolen hours where Vola taught him the names of the peaks around the fjord in her own tongue, and Calvin taught her, in turn, the calls of the birds that wintered in Bramwell's wood, and where the charged, careful distance between chieftess and gamekeeper dissolved, again and again, into something neither of them was any good at hiding. Edmund noticed first, because Edmund noticed anything that threatened to inconvenience him. He cornered Calvin outside the stables one gray morning, arms crossed, mouth twisted into something between a sneer and genuine confusion. "You've been meeting the chieftess," Edmund said. "Alone, on the ridge." "We've been discussing boundary lines," Calvin said, which was not entirely a lie, though it left out most of the truth. "Boundary lines." Edmund's laugh was ugly. "Doyle, I don't care what you get up to with an orc, truly I don't. But if this jeopardizes my uncle's treaty, if you cost House Bramwell a peace we've bled a generation to reach, I will see you strung up myself and call it justice." "Nothing I've done has jeopardized anything," Calvin said evenly, though his hands had curled to fists at his sides. "See that it stays that way." Edmund's eyes flicked over him with cold contempt. "She's meant to marry into a house that matters, gamekeeper, not waste her nights on a man who mucks out another lord's deer trails. Whatever she's told you on that ridge, don't mistake it for anything but a chieftess bored of her own hall." Calvin might have let the insult to himself pass, might have swallowed it the way he'd swallowed 100 small slights in his life as an overlooked, unremarkable man. But he'd seen, that same afternoon, the way Edmund spoke to the clan serving girls, sharp and dismissive, the way he'd kicked aside a child's carved wooden toy left in the hall without so much as a glance to see whose it was, the small, casual cruelties of a man who had never once had to consider that the people around him were people. He thought of Vola's earlier words, "He has never once looked me in the eye when he speaks," and something in him hardened. "You're not fit to sit at her table, let alone in her hall as her husband," Calvin said quietly. "Whatever happens between me and the chieftess is my business and hers, but you do well to remember she's not a treaty clause. She's a woman who's kept her people fed through 2 hard winters while men like you sat comfortable behind stone walls complaining of the smell of tanning pits. Watch how you speak of her." Edmund's face went red, then white, and for a moment Calvin thought the man might actually swing at him. But Edmund only turned on his heel and stalked off toward the hall, muttering something about gamekeepers who forgot their place, and Calvin let out a long breath and did not feel, in that moment, 1 ounce of regret. He should have known it would not simply end there. The threat that turned everything came not from Edmund's wounded pride but from the mountains themselves. 3 days later, a runner came down from the high scout posts with word that a rival clan, the Chieftess, old enemies of the Doomhammers from a border dispute 2 generations deep, had crossed into Doomhammer territory under cover of a snowstorm, raiding an outlying steading and driving off half its livestock. Vola, furious and already pulling on her sword belt before the runner had finished speaking, gathered a warband within the hour, and Calvin, without entirely thinking it through, found himself asking to ride with them. "You are not one of my warriors," Vola said, buckling a vambrace with quick, efficient motions, not unkindly but firm. "I know the wood better than anyone in your warband who isn't a Doomhammer scout," Calvin said. "I can track, I can shoot, and I'd rather be useful than sit in that hall wondering if you're alive." She studied him a long moment, and whatever she saw in his face, stubbornness, maybe, or something that looked enough like love that she could not argue with it, made her nod once sharply. "Stay behind my shield line. I will not lose you to Chieftess spears because you wanted to prove something." They rode out into a whitening sky, 20 warriors and 1 gamekeeper, following the runner's trail up through narrowing gorges where the wind screamed between the rock walls, until they came upon the steading at dusk. A scatter of burning outbuildings, a handful of terrified goat herds huddled behind a stone wall, and the retreating shapes of Chieftess raiders driving stolen cattle up a narrow defile toward the pass. The fight that followed was brief and brutal in the way mountain skirmishes always were. No grand battle lines, just running, screaming chaos in the dark between rock outcrops, torches guttering in the wind, the clash of axe on shield. Calvin loosed arrows where he could, dragged a wounded Doomhammer warrior out of the path of a falling, burning beam, and lost track entirely of where Vola had gone in the smoke and confusion, until he heard her voice raised in a battle cry above the din, and turned to see her locked blade to blade with a Chieftess warrior twice her breadth, both of them slipping on ice-slick stone at the very lip of a drop that fell 40 feet to a frozen creek bed below. Calvin did not think. He ran, snow spraying from his boots, and as the Chieftess warrior wrenched his axe free of Vola's guard and raised it for a killing blow, Calvin slammed his shoulder into the man's side with everything his body had, sending all 3 of them sprawling, himself, Vola, and the raider, in a tangle at the very edge of the drop. The axe skittered away across the ice. The raider, cursing, scrambled for a knife at his belt, and it was Vola who moved first this time, twisting free of the pile and driving her own blade home before the man could rise, ending it. For a moment the 2 of them simply lay there in the snow at the cliff's edge, breathing hard, the sounds of the retreating skirmish fading around them, and Vola turned her head to look at Calvin with an expression somewhere between fury and disbelief. "You could have died," she said, voice ragged, "throwing yourself at an armed man with no weapon in your hand." "So could you," Calvin said, "fighting a man twice your size at the edge of a cliff. That is my duty. Well, apparently it's mine too now." He reached out, brushing snow from her cheek with a hand that was shaking, whether from cold or fear he couldn't say. "I wasn't going to watch you die either, Vola. Not after everything." Something in her face broke open then, all the fierce control cracking just for a moment, and she pulled him against her there in the snow, holding on with a desperate strength that spoke of a woman unused to needing anyone and undone by discovering that she did. "I have led warriors for 6 years, she said into his hair, low and rough. "I have buried more of my own than I can count. I did not think there was room left in me to be afraid of losing someone." "You have proven me wrong, Calvin Doyle, and I do not know if I thank you for it or curse you." "Little of both, probably," Calvin murmured, and felt her laugh, shaky and real, against his shoulder. They rode back to Skarnholt in the gray dawn with the recovered cattle and their wounded, and that night, in the aftermath of battle and the raw relief of survival, when Vola came to the small storeroom chamber where Calvin lay awake unable to sleep, Neither of them pretended any more that this was anything but exactly what it was. She came to him not as a chieftess granting a favor, but as a woman who had nearly lost something she had only just discovered she wanted beyond reason, and he met her the same way, both of them slow and careful, and then not careful at all. The cold mountain night forgotten in the warmth they found together. Her hands finding the places where his years of quiet, overlooked labor had built lean strength into his body. His hands finding the old scars that mapped her own history of survival. Both of them murmuring things in the dark that neither had said aloud to another living soul. I want you. I need you, stay. Don't leave, I choose this, I choose you, until the words blurred into something wordless and whole. Afterward, in the gray hour before dawn, Vola took a slender leather cord from a pouch at her belt, worked through with small iron rings like the ones in her hair, and tied it around Calvin's wrist with careful, deliberate fingers. Among my people, she said quietly, a warrior gives such a cord to one they claim as their own. It is not a marriage. It is older than marriage, it says. This one is mine, and I am answerable for him before any who would harm him. Calvin looked down at the cord, dark against his skin, and felt something settle into place in his chest that had been restless and searching his whole life. And what does the one wearing it say back? That he accepts the claim, Vola said, and makes one of his own if he wishes it. Calvin had nothing so fine to give her, no iron rings, no ancestral leather, but he took the small carved wooden bird he'd whittled through long winter nights alone in his gamekeeper's cottage, a habit from childhood he'd never outgrown, and pressed it into her palm. It's not much, he said, half embarrassed. I make them to pass the time, but it's the truest thing I own, and it's yours if you'll have it. Vola closed her fingers around the small carved bird as though it were forged of gold, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the dawn light. I will have it, she said, and I will have you, Calvin Doyle, law or no law, treaty or no treaty. I do not yet know how, but I have decided, and I do not unmake my decisions. He should have known, hearing that, exactly how much it would cost her to keep that promise. The treaty was set to be sealed 7 days later, on the night of the full moon, when the fjord's tide ran highest, and the clan traditionally held its great gatherings in the open court above the water. A wide, flat shelf of stone, ringed by standing torches and worn benches cut into the rock, where every soul of Skarnholt could gather beneath the sky to witness matters too important for four walls. Lord Bramwell, delighted that peace was finally within reach, had pressed the marriage clause one final time, softened now into a compromise. Edmund would not marry Vola outright, given the ancient law, but would instead be granted a formal betrothal in name, a symbolic joining to be blessed before the whole court, sufficient, in Bramwell's eyes, to bind both houses without technically breaking the ban of ashen vows. Vola had said little about it in the days leading up to the gathering, and Calvin, watching her grow quieter, more withdrawn, more sleepless, understood that she was fighting some battle inside herself that no blade could touch. He found her the night before the gathering standing alone on the ridge where they had first kissed, staring down at the black water of the fjord silvered with early moonlight. You could refuse the betrothal, he said, coming to stand beside her. You're chieftess. It's your choice. If I refuse it outright, Bramwell withdraws the treaty, and the raids begin again come spring, and my people starve through another war they are too thin to fight. Vola's hands were fists at her sides. If I accept it, even symbolically, I stand before my whole clan, and every elder who has ever doubted a woman could hold this seat, and I bind myself in the eyes of my own people to a man I do not want, for the sake of peace I do want. And you, her voice cracked just slightly, the first crack he had ever heard in it. You, I am meant to simply set aside, as though what happened between us on this ridge in that storeroom was nothing, as though the cord on your wrist means nothing. Vola. Calvin took her hand, the fist unclenching slowly under his touch. I don't want you to choose me over your people. I never wanted that. I fell for a woman who feeds her clan through hard winters and rides into raids herself and doesn't flinch from anything. If setting me aside is what saves them, I'll bear it. I'll hate every day of it, but I'll bear it, because that's what loving you means." She turned to him then, and there were tears standing unshed in her amber eyes, fierce and furious at their own existence. "That is exactly why I cannot do it," she said. "Because a man who would bear his own heartbreak silently for the sake of my people deserves better than to be set aside like a debt paid and forgotten. I did not survive 6 years as chieftess, Calvin, by making the easy choice when it was also the wrong one. I do not intend to start tomorrow night. What are you going to do?" Vola looked back out over the black water, jaw set, and when she spoke again, her voice had steadied into something Calvin recognized from the winter wood, from the battle at the steading, the voice of a woman who had decided and would not be moved. "Tomorrow," she said, "the whole court will gather to watch me hand my life to a treaty clause. Instead, they will watch me hand it to the man who earned it, ban or no ban." The great open court above the fjord had never held so many at once, or so Calvin was told by the old woman who guided him to his place at the edge of the gathering the following evening. Every elder, every warrior, every craftsman and herder and child of Scarnholt packed onto the torchlit stone shelf, along with Lord Bramwell's full delegation arrayed on a lower tier, banners snapping in the wind that always seemed to rise off that black water at dusk. Bonfires roared at intervals along the stone, throwing gold light up into a sky just beginning to show stars, and at the center of it all stood a low dais of the same black stone as the great halls, where the elders sat in a half-circle, Croth prominent among them, and where Vola would stand to speak the words that would bind, or unbind, everything. Calvin's heart had not stopped hammering since he'd taken his place near the front of the human delegation, the leather cord at his wrist hidden beneath his sleeve, though he suspected it would not stay hidden long. Lord Bramwell rose first, resplendent in furs against the mountain cold, and made his speech of peace and prosperity and the joining of houses, gesturing for Edmund to stand at his side, and Edmund did, looking, for once, faintly nervous rather than merely sour, as though even he understood the weight of what was being asked of the woman across from him. Then Vola rose. She wore, Calvin saw with a jolt, not her usual green warrior's leathers but a version cut for ceremony, the same clothes, fitted lines, but dyed a deep black, edged in hammered iron plates that caught the bonfire light, her hair fully unbound for the first occasion Calvin had seen, black and heavy down her back, the iron rings threaded through it chiming softly as she moved to the center of the dais. She looked, standing there before her entire clan and the human lords who had come to bargain for her hand, like exactly what she was, a woman who held more power in her stillness than any blade in that court. "My people," she said, and her voice carried easily over the crowd, pitched to fill the open air the way Calvin's never could. "For 6 years I have led you. I have buried our dead beside you. I have gone hungry beside you through winters the Giatren and the border lords both made harder than they needed to be. I have never once asked you to trust a choice of mine that I did not believe, with everything in me, was right for this clan." A murmur of assent moved through the crowd. Croth, on the dais, watched her with narrowed eyes, sensing, perhaps, that something was about to happen that had not been in the agreed script of the evening. "Lord Bramwell offers peace," Vola went on, "bound by a symbolic joining between myself and his nephew. It would satisfy the treaty. It would satisfy the law of the Ashen Vow, since it asks for no true marriage." She paused, and the pause stretched long enough that even the bonfires seemed to hold their breath. "But I did not survive as your chieftess by choosing what merely satisfies, when something truer is standing in front of me." She turned then, away from Edmund and Lord Bramwell entirely, and looked out into the crowd, directly at Calvin, and every head in that court turned to follow her gaze, hundreds of eyes landing on the human gamekeeper standing near the edge of the gathering with his heart in his throat. "There is a man in this court," Vola said, "who stood unarmed between me and 3 drawn bows the first time we met, though he owed me nothing and risked everything. Who has ridden into a raid at my side, though it was never his fight. who has never once asked me to be anything other than exactly what I am. I have given him my claim before this night in the old way, with cord and carved token, as any warrior may claim the one they choose. I do so again now before you all, because I will not stand in front of my own people and pretend that what is true between us is a shameful secret to be buried for the sake of a treaty. She reached up and drew from beneath her collar the small carved wooden bird Calvin had given her, holding it aloft for the whole court to see. I will not marry Edmund Bramwell, symbolically or otherwise, she said, and her voice rang out clear and unshaking over the gathered crowd. The ban of Ashen Vows says no Doomhammer chieftain may wed human blood. I say the Ashen Vow was broken by a coward who opened our gates to slaughter, and I will not let his cowardice bind my heart 200 years after his bones went to dust. I choose Calvin Doyle, gamekeeper, human, my equal in every way that has ever mattered to me, and if this court cannot accept a chieftess's own heart, then let it say so to my face. For one breathless moment, silence held the entire court, the fires crackling, the wind off the fjord the only sound, and then it broke all at once into chaos. Croth was on his feet first, roaring something in the clan's old tongue that needed no translation, his voice joined by a dozen other elders and warriors surging up from their seats, and the crowd itself seemed to catch fire with it, shouts of betrayal and outrage rolling across the stone court like a wave, warriors reaching for weapons they had left, out of respect, sheathed for the gathering, hands going to knife hilts and axe handles. The whole assembly tipping in an instant from ceremony into something far more dangerous. Lord Bramwell's delegation, for their part, looked on in stunned horror, Edmund red-faced with humiliation, Bramwell already calculating visibly what this meant for his precious treaty. She has broken the Ashen Vow before the whole court, Croth bellowed, striding toward the dais, hand on his sword. The law demands exile, or worse, and the human who tempted her to it deserves no less than the sword. The crowd surged forward with him, a wall of furious clan folk, and Calvin, without a single conscious decision to do so, found his feet already carrying him forward, shoving through the press of bodies until he stood on the open stone before the dais, directly between Vola and the advancing wall of angry warriors. His arms spread the same way they had been spread in the winter wood, empty and unarmed and utterly immovable. "If someone's going to die for this," Calvin shouted, his voice raw but carrying, "let it be me first, because I'll not stand aside while you punish her for choosing honesty over a lie your treaty wanted." Calvin, no, Vola's voice behind him, cracked with something between fury and terror, and she moved to shield him in turn, stepping up beside him with her own blade drawn now, putting her body half in front of his even as he refused to yield his place in front of her, the two of them forming an absurd, stubborn wall of two against a crowd of dozens, neither willing to let the other take the worse of it. "Get behind me," she snarled at him. "Not a chance," Calvin snarled back, and despite the chaos, despite the very real danger crackling in the air around them, something in her face flickered, just for an instant, with something that was almost a laugh. Croth stopped his advance perhaps 10 feet away, close enough that Calvin could see the fury and the grief both warring in the old warrior's scarred face, and it was grief, Calvin realized suddenly, grief 200 years old, that drove the man forward as much as anger. "You do not understand what that vow cost us," Croth said, and his voice, for the first time, shook. "My own grandmother's grandmother died on this stone when the gates opened. I have carried that grief since I was old enough to understand it. And now our chieftess stands before us and asks us to simply forget it, for the sake of a gamekeeper's pretty words." "I do not ask you to forget it," Vola said, and her voice had gentled, though the blade in her hand did not lower. "I ask you to see that I am not the chieftess who opened those gates, and Calvin Doyle is not the coward who did it. He put himself between me and arrows before he knew my name. He rode into a raid that was never his fight and pulled a Gatren warrior off me with his bare hands. If the Ashen Vow exists to protect this clan from betrayal, then look at the man standing in front of me now, refusing to move even as your own warriors ready their blades against him, and tell me honestly whether that is the face of a betrayer." The court had gone quiet again, an uneasy, trembling quiet, dozens of warriors caught between old grief and the strange, undeniable image in front of them. A human standing his ground, unarmed, in front of an entire clan's fury, not to save himself but to shield a woman who did not need shielding and had shielded him in turn. It was an old woman who broke the silence this time, not Croth, a bent, white-haired elder Calvin had not noticed before, who rose slowly from a bench near the dais with the aid of a gnarled staff, her voice thin but carrying with the particular authority of great age. "Elder Iasa," Vola breathed, surprised. "There is a second law," the old woman said, older even than the Ashen Vow, that this court has forgotten because it has not been invoked in 3 lifetimes. The right of the chosen blade. Before the Ashen Vow was ever written, a chieftain could set aside any clan law forbidding a match, provided the one they chose proved themselves before the whole clan in trial, not of blood alone, but of worth. If the human is willing to stand such a trial, and the chieftess still stands beside him after, no law of ours may separate them, Ashen Vow or no. Croth's jaw worked, torn between the old grief that had driven him and the older law that now bound even him. A trial of what nature? "Combat," Elder Iasa said simply. "Against a champion of the clan's choosing. Not to the death, we are not so barbarous as the Ashen Tale makes us seem, but to first blood or to yield. If the human stands his ground and does not yield, his worth is proven, whatever the outcome." Calvin felt Vola's hand find his in the firelit chaos, gripping hard enough to hurt. "You do not have to do this," she said, low, urgent, only for him. "I will find another way. I stood in front of arrows for you before I even knew your name," Calvin said, and though his voice shook, his resolve did not. "I think I can stand in front of one more fight for the chance to keep you." Croth, to no one's surprise, named himself the champion. The circle they cleared was the same open stone where the court had gathered, torches repositioned to ring a rough fighting ground, the crowd pressing close on all sides, breathless with an entirely different energy now. Not fury exactly, but a kind of fascinated dread, waiting to see whether the strange human gamekeeper would break or hold. Vola pressed a blade into Calvin's hand before he stepped into the circle, not her own sword, but a shorter blade, better suited to a man untrained in a warrior's long forms, and gripped his shoulder hard. "Watch his left shoulder before he swings," she said quietly, fast, the only lesson she had time to give him. "He favors it, and do not try to match his strength. You cannot. Match his patience instead. He is old, Calvin, and old men tire before young ones if you make them work for it." "I'll remember," Calvin said, and she kissed him once, hard and brief, in front of the entire watching court, an act nearly as scandalous in that moment as her declaration had been, before stepping back to let him face Croth alone. The fight that followed was not the stuff of songs. Calvin was no warrior. He knew this, and so, plainly, did the crowd, murmuring low as Croth's first heavy strike sent him staggering back, barely deflected. But Calvin had spent years in Bramwell's Wood outrunning poachers twice his size and tracking wounded game across country that would break lesser men's legs, and he had, if nothing else, a gamekeeper's patience and a gamekeeper's stubborn endurance. He gave ground when he had to, circled when Croth's heavier frame tired faster on the uneven stone, took a shallow cut along his forearm without crying out, and twice used the shorter blade not to overpower the older warrior, but simply to survive his blows long enough for Croth's breath to grow ragged. It was on Croth's own left shoulder, exactly as Vola had warned, that the old warrior finally overextended a swing, and Calvin, more from luck and exhaustion-born instinct than any skill, stepped inside the arc of the blow and put the flat of his blade hard against Croth's ribs, not a killing strike, not even truly a wounding one, but enough, clearly, to have ended the exchange had Calvin chosen violence over restraint. He did not press the advantage. He stepped back instead, breathing hard, blade lowered, and said, loud enough for the circle to hear, "I don't want to hurt you, old man. I never did. I just don't intend to yield." Croth stood there a long moment, chest heaving, blade still raised, and then slowly lowered it, and something like respect, grudging, unwilling, but real, settled into the deep lines of his face. "He does not yield," Croth announced to the court, turning to face them, "and he did not seek to kill me when the strike was there to take. I have carried grief over the ashen vow longer than any man living. I do not forgive it tonight. But I will not stand against a right older than my grief, nor against a man who fought with more honor in that circle than I expected of him." The court that had been ready moments before to see Calvin Doyle bleed for his honesty now stood in a strange, shifting quiet, watching their chieftess cross the stone circle to the exhausted, bleeding gamekeeper, cup his face in both hands, and press her forehead to his amid the guttering torchlight. "You held," she murmured, "only for him. You held, and you did not yield, and you did not need to become something you are not to do it." "I told you I wasn't going anywhere," Calvin said, breathless, blood drying on his forearm, and around them, slowly, unevenly, the crowd's silence broke into something else, not full acceptance, not yet, but the beginning of it, a murmur that was no longer purely hostile, warriors lowering weapons they had half raised, elders exchanging long, considering looks. It was Elder Iasa who spoke the words that settled it, striking her staff once against the stone. "The right is satisfied. The ban of ashen vows does not bind where the right of the chosen blade has been honored. Let it be known through Scarnholt and beyond it. Our chieftess has chosen, and her choice stands proven." Lord Bramwell, for his part, salvaged what dignity he could, declaring with visible relief at an outcome that at least preserved his treaty, even if it cost him his nephew's marriage prospects. That house, Bramwell would honor the peace regardless of whom the chieftess married, since the treaty's true purpose, he claimed with only slight exaggeration, had always been peace between their peoples rather than any particular joining of blood. Edmund said nothing at all, which was, in its way, the wisest thing he did that entire evening. The treaty was signed 3 days later without a marriage clause of any kind, sealed instead by an exchange of gifts and grain and a promise of shared borders. And if it was a quieter, less politically dramatic peace than Lord Bramwell had originally envisioned, it was, everyone privately agreed, a far more honest one. Calvin remained at Scarnholt through the rest of that winter, his arm healing, the leather cord never leaving his wrist, and in the slow turning of those months he watched, with a kind of disbelieving gratitude, as the clan folk who had nearly torn him apart in that court began, one by one, to accept him, not effusively, not all at once, but in small, real ways. A warrior nodding to him in the yard where once there had been only suspicion, children asking him to carve them small wooden birds like the one their chieftess wore now openly at her throat, even Croth himself, one bitter cold evening, sitting down across the hearth from him uninvited and grunting out a story of the ashen vows. True history, grief shared rather than weaponized, an old man's way of saying he had, at least, stopped wanting Calvin's head on a pike. Vola and Calvin were bound properly that spring, in a ceremony far smaller and quieter than the chaos of the court that had first declared them. A private rite among Vola's closest kin and the elders who had come to accept the match, held not in the great court, but on the ridge above the fjord where they had first kissed, where Vola tied a second cord beside the first, this one woven through with a single small iron ring of her own hair, and Calvin, in turn, gave her a carved wooden ring for her own finger, crude beside the fine ironwork the clan favored but made, she told him, exactly right because his hands had made it. But the ending Calvin had never quite let himself hope for came later still, in early summer, when he brought Vola down from the highlands for the first time to see Ashford Hollow, the small border village at the edge of Bramwell's Wood where he had grown up an overlooked, ordinary man before a chieftess had ever looked at him and seen someone worth choosing. He had warned her, riding down the mountain road, that Ashford Hollow's folk had little reason to love orcs' old war stories, burned steadings, sons who had not come home from border skirmishes. The same grief that had driven Croth's fury turned instead into a village's quiet, ordinary prejudice. He had warned her, too, that he did not know how they would receive her, chieftess or not, and Vola had only squared her shoulders and said, "I have stood before a court that wanted my head for choosing you, Calvin Doyle. I do not fear a village square." The village folk gathered in that square the evening they arrived, drawn by the rare sight of an orc riding openly down the main track past the mill, and the smithy, and the little stone chapel. And the murmurs that rose were not warm, old Widow Ferris crossing herself, the tavern keeper's son fetching his father's old spear from above the hearth, more than a few doors closing rather than opening. It was not politics or law that turned that particular tide in the end, but a wolf. A pack, driven down from the high country by a hard, dry summer, had been harrying Ashford Hollow's flocks for a fortnight, and on the very evening of Calvin and Vola's arrival, as the uneasy crowd watched from doorways and fences, the alarm bell rang out from the sheep pens at the village edge, wolves in the fold, in broad daylight, bold with hunger. Calvin ran without thinking, and Vola ran beside him, and it was Vola who reached the pens first, vaulting the low stone wall in one motion the villagers would talk about for years afterward, driving off the largest of the pack with nothing but her belt knife and sheer, fearless strength, standing between the terrified flock and the snapping jaws until the rest of the pack, sensing a fight not worth the cost, melted back into the tree line. She stood there afterward, breathing hard, streaked with dust and one shallow scratch along her forearm, in the middle of a pen full of frightened, bleating sheep that belonged to people who, moments before, had been ready to bar their doors against her. And the silence that fell over the gathered village was not the silence of fear this time, but something closer to shame, and beneath the shame, the first uncertain seed of gratitude. It was old Widow Ferris, of all people, who broke it, climbing stiffly over the fence to press a clean cloth into Vola's hand for the scratch on her arm, her voice gruff but not unkind. "That's my flock you just saved, and I've nothing but poor thanks to give for it beyond this rag and an old woman's word that I judged too quick." "An honest word is enough," Vola said, and something in her voice, tired and simple and entirely without the cool command of a chieftess in court, seemed to settle something in the watching crowd more than any speech could have. By the time the summer turned toward harvest, Vola Doomhammer had become, improbably, a fixture of Ashford Hollow's seasons, helping mend fences after storms with a strength no local man could match, sitting some evenings at the tavern table trading stories of the Highlands for stories of the border wood, teaching a few of the braver village children to whittle after seeing the small wooden birds Calvin still carved out of old habit, until half the village's window ledges held some small carved creature made under her patient, amused instruction. The old fear did not vanish entirely. Some doors remained closed a while longer, some old grief too deep to fully soften, but it thinned, season by season, into something closer to ordinary neighborliness, until the day of the harvest festival, when the whole village gathered in the same square that had once eyed her with spears, and Vola Doomhammer sat at the long communal table beside Calvin Doyle, sharing a single loaf and a single cup passed hand to hand down the table in the old border custom. A symbol of trust between neighbors, and no one at that table hesitated to pass it to her. Calvin watched her laugh at something old Widow Ferris said, watched the firelight from the festival bonfire catch gold in her dark skin and warm in her amber eyes, watched her reach without thinking to twine her fingers with his beneath the table the way she had done 100 times now, easy and certain, and felt something in his chest settle fully into place. The same overlooked, ordinary gamekeeper who had once stood alone and unremarkable at the edge of his own quiet life. now sitting at the center of a home he had never expected to have, beside a woman who had broken her own clan's oldest law rather than set him aside, who had chosen him in front of arrows and in front of an entire furious court and had never once since looked back. "You are thinking too hard again," Vola said, leaning close, her breath warm against his ear over the noise of the festival. "I can hear you thinking, Calvin Doyle." "Just thinking that I never thought I'd end up here," Calvin admitted. "Loved, chosen, by someone who could have had anyone." "I did not want anyone," Vola said simply, pressing her forehead to his the way she had done on the night of the trial, the same gesture, worn now into something tender rather than desperate. "I wanted you. I have never once regretted the wanting, and I do not intend to start on a night this fine, with good bread and better company." Around them, the festival went on. Firelight and music and the easy laughter of a village that had learned, slowly and honestly, to see past old fear into something better. And above the square, beyond the wood Calvin had once guarded alone and now guarded as a man no longer alone at all. The same stars that watched over the black water of the distant fjord watched over Ashford Hollow too, steady and unchanging, while a chieftess and a gamekeeper sat together at a shared table home at last. In every way that mattered,